Morality is not the doctrine of how we may see ourselves happy, but how we may make ourselves worthy of happiness. I like that quote. It's from philosopher Immanuel Kant, and I think it ties into our conversation today. Because today, on the Don't Panic, We're All Gonna Die podcast, we discuss philosophy, specifically ethics and morality, and I can't imagine a better guest to join me than today's guest, Professor Pamela Hieronymi. Pamela is an American philosopher / moral psychologist whose work focuses on ethics, philosophy of mind, free will, and the subject of today's conversation, moral responsibility. Professor Hieronymi received her bachelor's degree from Princeton before earning her Ph.D. from Harvard. Of course, she's also a gifted writer and has written a number of articles ranging from topics like forgiveness and blame to more traditional philosophical concepts like contractualism and ethical theory. But wait, there's more. Professor Hieronymi also served as the main consulting philosopher for the popular television series The Good Place. For those who haven't seen it, it's a show created by Michael Schur, who also did The Office and Parks and Rec, and it's really good. I'm not just saying that. It's funny, and its central theme is the question of what does being a good person actually look like. So, very appropriate theme for this podcast. Now, this is a question that I find myself asking all the time, and so selfishly, this was a really great conversation for me. But, of course, I hope that you feel the same way. So let's get into it. This is my conversation with Professor Pamela Hieronymi. So, Pamela Hieronymi, so good to have you on the podcast. I did some research into you prior to this conversation, and the more I read, the more excited I got to have this conversation. And you know what's funny is I wanted to speak to a professor of ethics or a moral psychologist, and so I went through UCLA because that's the college that's closest to me through the philosophy department and found you. But I understand that Michael Schur, the creator of The Office in Parks and Rec, and trying to do research for The Good Place, he did the same exact thing in
That's
finding
right.
you. So how did that kind of come about?
I think just like you described, he had an idea for a show in mind and he wanted it was going to involve a lot of philosophy. So he thought he should talk to some philosophers. And looking at my website as a local philosopher, I had a paper on the website described called Attempting Virtue, which at one point was called Why You Can't Be Good by Trying. And it describes the sort of difficulty that the main character in his show, which was The Good Place, found herself in, which is that she wasn't a good person and had ulterior reasons to want to become a good person and was trying to, become a good person for bad reasons. So he wanted to talk to me about that. So we set up a coffee date and talked about that and talked about a whole lot of other things. And then he ended up having me back to talk to the writers once he got his writers room assembled, and it was terrifically fun.
Yeah, sounds like a really fun experience. I've watched a few seasons of the show, so just being part of it in any capacity seems really fun. I did want to just learn a little bit more about you. Very decorated background, but I understand that you started by organizing a book club to study Descartes when you were like in elementary school. Is that correct?
I didn't really just do a book club, but what happened is when I was in elementary school, I was shipped off halfway across the county to go to a gifted program. So we had a very long bus ride, me and all the other nerdy kids, and we would sit in the back of the bus and argue about things. And I came home one night and told my dad about what we were talking about. And he had been a philosophy major in college. And he said, "Oh, I have a book for you." And he pulled out Descartes' Meditations because we were talking essentially about the evil demon hypothesis. Like, what if we're all being deceived by an evil demon, or the new and updated version is the Matrix? What if we're all living in the Matrix? And so I brought that back to my nerdy friends on the nerdy school bus, and we continued to argue about it.
That's so fun. That definitely is a far cry from anything that I was doing at that age, but but also really, really cool to hear. So I think what sticks out to me about that story is that like you knew, at least it seems to me that you knew that philosophy was something that you wanted to pursue from a very young age. So how does that look like? Because I know that you're very established now. How does the path look like from being, a kid who's interested in philosophy to being a philosophy professor?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I wasn't sure that I was going to study philosophy when I went to college. I kind of didn't know what I was going to study. I think I put on my application English and physics and engineering. And, I really had no idea. But looking back, I can say that I was interested in philosophical questions, as long as I can remember, and that I'm twisted in just the right way to pursue this field, to pursue these questions. So sometimes people say, well, what experiences, made you into a philosopher, or how has philosophy changed you? And I think, no, I started this way and I just happened to find where I fit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you feel like you fit in any camp specifically? Because like I've read a good amount, and I've always gravitated, just time and time again, I've always gravitated towards like the existentialists and the Stoics, just because I feel like that's how my
Mhm.
brain works. Do you feel
Yeah.
any type of pull in any direction from your study?
Yeah. So I am also find myself back with the existentialists and with Sartre in particular, though I spend very little time actually reading those figures, and I should do more of that. And then in ethics and in ethical theory, which is what I spend a lot of my time teaching, I find myself resonating most with contractualism as an ethical theory, which actually got some love from The Good Place. The book What We Owe to Each Other was actually showed up on The Good Place, which was a lot of fun because it's just a huge contemporary philosophy book.
Yeah. Well, you're really good at coming up with titles for a lot of your papers. I think like philosophical writing tends to be dense, but I find that yours is really refreshing, especially your lectures.
Thank you. Thank you.
I very easy to keep up with. But you touched on something that I thought was interesting, which was the good place. This question of what do we owe each other. You mentioned that the main character is somebody who's trying to be good,
Hmm.
and I know that you have reservations about trying to be
Hmm.
good. But I was hoping maybe could you unpack what contractualism is for the listeners, and then maybe explain why no one can try and be good.
I can. Those are actually two distinct topics. So
Okay.
which one would you like me to do first?
Okay. Well, let's talk about contractualism because you brought it up, and I think it might be a good
Yeah,
way to set the stage for the conversation.
sure. So contractualism is the moral theory that has grown out of social contract theory, which was a political theory. And social contract theory grew out of a period of history in which there was a lot of religious wars, and in which the task at hand was to try to figure out how to live together peacefully with people with whom we disagree fundamentally. And contractualism as a moral theory takes the solution to that problem from political theory into morality. So it's really takes the guiding moral question not to be what's the good life for human beings, or what's the best way to be a human being, or how should everyone live to fulfill their purpose in life. So those are very grand questions. Contractualism as a moral theory asks a much lower down question, a much more basic question, which is just how can we live together peacefully and respectfully? What are the minimum principles or rules we need to abide by if we're going to treat one another with respect across our differences? And the way it arrives at an answer to that question, what are the minimum rules, it doesn't actually tell you what those rules are. It tells you what they would have to be like. And what they would have to be like is this: they would have to be the rules that we would come up with if we were committed above everything else to finding some such rules, and we treated everyone symmetrically. So to make that a little more concrete, if you go back to the scene of religious wars, or back to Westphalia, back to where you have groups of people exhausted from fighting, but still equally powerful, but determined to find a truce. And then you think, what are the terms of that truce? Well, no one's going to be willing to agree to anything that's not fair to them because they're still equally powerful. But no one's going to insist on more than what's fair because they want to come to a truce. And so the terms that you end up with are going to be the terms that treat everyone fairly, or symmetrically. And so contractualism as a moral theory says, in effect, that morality happens when we treat each other like that, even though we're not equally powerful. we live by the terms we would come to agree with if we were equally powerful, even when we're not. And that's the way that we respect one another. That's the way we show that we give each person equal standing, and so live together peacefully. Now, which rules those will be was going to be a really hard question. And contractualism as a moral theory doesn't spit out, answers to specific questions. It tells you instead what the form of such an answer would be, and so what we would be disagreeing about when we disagree about which things are morally permissible.
Okay. So that's an interesting and an ethical concept, because it's like there are things that we kind of have agreed to, right, in society. I think cutting a line is one that's used quite often. Like, we see a line, we stand in the back of the line, or just speed limits, like whatever common laws that we seem to understand. But then, how does it factor in for merit? Because like you mentioned yourself, like not everyone is equal. I'm better at some things than other people, and there's plenty of people that are better at things than me. So I'm just curious how merit factors into this idea.
So it's a great question, and people who are interested in merit, and now I'm thinking of merit as a kind of economic issue, or a question of like, if I produce more, do I deserve more? That kind of, or if I'm better at it, should I get the job, or that kind of. Is that what you're thinking of in terms of merit?
Well, I'm kind of thinking of it in two different ways. So one of them is that way, right? Where it's like, I know the first settlers in America, they tried some level of communism where they were like, let's just all work together to survive. And then some people were putting in more, so they felt like they deserved more. So like there's that idea. But then there's an idea that I think is a little bit more modern, which is that, as technology progresses, there's going to be like a huge amount of people who no longer will have work because that work has been automated for them. And the people who are going to be still working and maybe still taking in more income are going to be people who have found a way to use a very specific set of skills or their intellect to make some type of profit. So I'm just curious, from maybe an ethical perspective, like where does that leave the huge amount of the population that is not going to be able to do that for themselves? And how do we, or not we, but like how does one like respond to that? Because they're going to have to be looked at after in some way, even though they're not producing something, right? So I don't know. That's just a question that I had for you, and I hope it made sense coming out like it did.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a big question. It's a deep question, and one thing that it puts pressure on is the idea of property and the idea of what property is. And most Americans operate, I think, with a broadly speaking Lockean idea of property, according to which when you mix your labor with something, it becomes yours. So John Locke started in the Second Treatise of Governments. He started with this interesting question, which was in Genesis, as he read Genesis, God left the earth to humankind in common. So how does anything ever become private property? There in England, where people are fencing off land, like God left the earth in common. Why do you get to fence off land? And his answer was, he kind of started with the very most basic thing of, if I go and pick an apple off a tree and eat it, it certainly has become mine. It's now incorporated into my body, right? So his thought was, well, when you mix your labor with something, it becomes yours. But then he had this very important proviso. It's called the Lockean proviso, which is, as long as there is as much and as good for others. So it's a idea of property that works very well in a frontier situation, like when you have an expand, like the American frontier. But in thinking about that, it's important to realize that property itself, the idea that something is yours, is an ethical idea, right? Possession is not ownership, right? So just having it in your power is not the same thing as it being rightly yours. The question of what's rightly yours is an ethical question or a legal question. And we hope that the law, I think, tracks the ethics, because otherwise it seems like, again, it's just power. So the Lockean picture is a picture of how to think about the ethics of property. But as I mentioned, it works best in a frontier kind of situation where there's as much as is good for others kind of just out there on Earth. Mm-hmm. We are no longer in a frontier situation.
Yeah.
And in the time since Locke, we learned that, and this was something that it's kind of amazing that humanity needed to learn, but we learned that wealth can expand.
As you were speaking, I had a question that rose in my head, and it's something that I realized that I've thought about so much, but I never had the chance to ask anybody who is as involved in philosophy as you. So I want to ask you, and I'm going to try my best to phrase it as a question, because it's kind of, so essentially, I feel like in philosophy, there are these universal truths that we have kind of discovered. And I think that's like what Western philosophy is based off of. So you have the Aristotelian mean. I think that's kind of just like a true thing. And I feel like a lot of like what Socrates and Aristotle and those guys were doing was like setting a foundation for what can be considered truth. And it seems to me like there are some where like when I'm reading them, I'm like, yeah, they're right. This is still true. And then to your point about John Locke, having a philosophy that was more fit for a frontier type of world, the world being America. I'm curious what your thoughts are on like philosophy being updated. Because my understanding, philosophy is like the way that most people I think understand it is through art. Like comes to a philosophical concept and then someone internalizes it and produces art. I really love both, but I'm curious what you think of like this idea of updating philosophies. Like, does philosophy need to be updated?
Yeah.
Or I'm just, I guess that's my question. Like, how do we go about updating philosophy?
I think philosophy is constantly updating. In fact, I think that's almost all it is. I mean, is that there are, philosophy, this is my opinion, and anything you say about philosophy, other philosophers will disagree with, but this is how I think of it.
Yeah, love that.
Is that it's the place in the university that houses questions we don't have methods for answering.
Mm.
So it was the place in the university where physics started until Newton figured out physics, and then physics became its own thing. It was the place where linguistics started until we figured out linguistics, logic, right? So philosophy, one thing that philosophy does is spin off other disciplines when you figure out the methodology for that discipline. And then that discipline, can do its thing.
Yeah.
But then there's other pieces of philosophy that are, I think, never going to spin out their own disciplines. One of them is ethics. Another one is epistemology. So that's the question. Those are the questions of how should we live and what should we believe? And they both concern justification. What are we justified in thinking? What are we justified in doing? And those questions of justification, I think, are essentially open questions that we're always having to, this is my existentialism showing, right? That we're always having to reconsider. And some of the same questions and issues that Aristotle looked at and that Aquinas looked at and that, all through history, as our material and cultural circumstances change, they take on slightly different angles. They have new ways they need to be addressed, new language. And so I think, you mentioned art. So you might think of art as the cultural expression of the human condition or something like that.
Yeah.
And philosophy, I think, at least in some stretches of it, that's what we're doing, is we're trying to think about what it is to live a human life and live a human life well, as in a changing world. And so it's constantly updating. It needs to update.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. And it's funny too, because like I suppose that like out of all the philosophies, if you could choose one to constantly need updating, I feel like it should be ethics,
Mm-hmm.
because the world is constantly changing. We're constantly coming to new conclusions of how we should treat each other. So I think to me that seems like the best one to be consistently updating. But I guess a question for you that I would have in response to that is like, if you're working, so you're a philosopher, you work in philosophy department, but you yourself have said it's the part of university where you deal with questions that don't have answers. Is that ever frustrating for you, knowing that like as much studying as you do, there's never really going to be an answer?
No, I love it. But it's, I mean, it is disconcerting, and it can be disconcerting for the students. And I take it to be one of the most important things I can do with my students is to try to give them the confidence to sit in a place where they don't have answers, and to find disagreement, and disagreement with one another, disagreement with people we read, disagreement in our society, to find disagreement even where they don't know where they sit, to be a matter of curiosity instead of a matter something to be afraid of.
Mm,
Um,
I love that. That's a great way to look at it.
And you know, it takes a certain amount of ego strength to do that. It takes a certain amount of self-confidence to be able to be
Yeah.
like, I don't know what the answer is, but and this question matters. And there's, you know, people who feel strongly one way and people who feel strongly another way, and I'm going to be curious about that. I'm going to make that a matter of my open-minded investigation instead of, you know, a reason to circle the wagons and start fighting.
I think that's a fantastic answer. And you know, it's interesting. Like I feel like where you maybe see yourself as being is someone who's doing that with ethics, right? Just exploring moral psychology. I feel like for me, it's more
Mm-hmm.
like I'm trying to do that with like existentialism and trying to explore. I don't think that happiness should be your goal, but I think meaning is a better one. Like exploring what it means to have meaning, or
Mm-hmm.
what it means to have purpose. But I did want to ask you, because you mentioned that I think you said it's important to make students feel comfortable with their curiosity, but that also that they can engage each other with their disagreements in a way that is civil and not circling wagons.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to hear from you. So one of the podcasts I was listening to, you said that you can't try to be a good person, and I found myself disagreeing with
Mm-hmm.
you. And so I'd love to hear
Uh-huh.
you elaborate on why you don't think you can try and be a good person.
Yeah, good. So Mike Schur also disagrees
Yeah.
with me on this. I have to say, my you can't be good by trying. It is clickbait, right? So it is overstatement. But the basic thought is this, that if you're not a good person, it's because you don't have the right motives, you don't have the right values and cares and concerns. And that was the situation that Eleanor in The Good Place found
Hmm.
herself in. She was wrongly put in the quote good place after death, and then she's trying to become a good person so she doesn't go to the bad place. So if you're needing to become a good person, it's because you're not, and that's because you don't have the right motives. And Aristotle said that one of the things you should do if you don't have the right motives is to do what the good person does, to basically try to fake it till you make it. And that's good advice. So that's why it's clickbait.
Hmm.
It's not that it's bad advice, but it's mysterious, right? Because motives aren't like muscles. Like if you just do the same motion over and over again at the gym, you will get better at it. You'll
Hmm.
get stronger at it. But by doing what the good person does for bad reasons, by faking it, if practice makes perfect, why don't you just become a really good faker?
Yeah.
Why is it that you actually have a transformation and start to become a better person? So that's the part that seems mysterious, that I think should seem mysterious. And if you think of effort as just sort of, gritting your teeth and doing it harder and harder, then I think what you're going to do is you're going to get really good at faking, right? Whereas what needs to happen is you need to have a change in, you need to be changed. You need to be changed from the outside. You need to come to see that how you were valuing things, how you were thinking of things before was mistaken, was wrong. And you need to come to see things the way the good person sees them. But having a change of view like that is something that needs receptivity, right? It's not all effort. There's something receptive. It's more like learning than it is like, going to the gym and pushing as hard as you can on the weights. And so that's the idea in that paper, is that there's something essentially receptive and a certain openness you need in order to have your motives changed in order to become the good person. So why does it work? Why does faking it help? Well, I think it's because if you do what the good person does, you put yourself in the way, so to speak, of experiencing what they experience. And so you put yourself sort of in the way of learning things that you wouldn't, if you're nice to people, they appreciate it and you get their gratitude. And now you've learned something about the possibilities of human interaction. But that's not just because you've gotten to be proficient at doing this thing, as so. And in the TV show, Mike put this in. So there's a spot at which Eleanor has to lose all hope of staying in the good place, and it's at that moment that she's able to act selflessly and for the good of her friends. And then it's a point system in there, but rack up all the points she needs, but she couldn't do it as long as she was doing it in order to save herself.
Well, you're convincing me a little bit, for sure. But I was just so what you're saying is, in order to be a good person, you have to have good values, and your motivations have to be coming from a place of sincerity, where you want to be good for reasons that are actually noble in some regard. Is that a fair way to categorize it?
Yeah. So, and the good person, here's one thing that isn't true. The good person doesn't do good things in order to be a good person.
That's a good point.
Right. So if you're doing them in order to be a good person, you're not doing them for the reason the good person does it.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, they also have that saying that's like, there's no such thing as a good deed, which is basically to say that even I've given money to charity before, and for me it was like, I got a bonus at work or something, and I was like, I have this money, I don't need all of it, I'm just gonna put it somewhere. And maybe that was me being a good person, maybe that was me trying to be a good person. But either way, it was some motivation, was like, this is gonna make me feel like a good person. So I almost feel like we don't ever do anything just because we're innately good or we have good values. I think all of us secretly, we kind of want that hit of that serotonin hit of oh, I am a good person. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, but I think if that's what we're doing, I mean, it's yeah, I think you're right that if that's what we're doing, there's something suspect about it. There's a thesis in philosophy that I think is not 100% true, but for a while I really wanted it to be true, but it's close. According to which the virtuous action is not done under the virtuous description. So that's to say, the kind action is not done because it's kind, like the person who's kind or courageous or honest, they're not acting with it in mind that they're being kind or courageous or honest. They're acting because this person needs help, or because that's the truth, or because this is important. And as a result, what they do, the rest of us look at and call it kind or courageous or honest, but that's not how it seems, from their point of view.
That's fair.
I don't think that's 100% true, but I think there's some important truth to it.
Yeah. I think that's a good thing to point out. And I think that a lot of these cases are circumstantial, where it's like, honestly, maybe me giving to charity might have been me just trying to be a good person, but there are certain times where I've acted to protect people, just to protect them, or there's
Right,
certain things you do just because they're the right thing to do, and you just that they align with your
right,
values. So I see what you're saying there.
right.
The only counterpoint I would maybe even I'd just like to hear your thoughts on this, but like for me, it's like the trying is like the important thing a lot of times, where it's like
Mm-hmm.
you can talk
Mm-hmm.
about something like I've seen you hear it a bunch of times, especially with guys, where they're like, "Oh man, if someone said that to me, like I would have smacked him in the face," and it's like, but you didn't. You didn't actually do the thing. It's just something that you say that you would do. But
Right.
if somebody is like, "Hey, it'd be cool is if we all got together and we all went to a soup kitchen and started helping out the homeless, and then they actually did it." It's like that person trying, like that's the important thing to
Yep.
me. So like when you say, well, you can't try to be a good person, I know you're being hyperbolic, but to me it's always seemed like
Mm-hmm.
trying was the only important thing.
Right. No, and that's Mike Schur's position as well. That's why he and I disagree so much on that podcast with Ezra Klein. But we don't, in fact, disagree. I think. I think at the end of the day, or we don't disagree much. He has a new book out called How to Be Perfect, which is him writing. It's funny. I recommend it. It's him trying to write down in a book all the things he learned about philosophy in the course of the television show.
Oh, for
And
sure.
yeah, it's a fun book. And towards the end of it, in chapter 10, he has a section where he's trying to talk about the fact that given the internet, given the world now, there's all of these people we love who do bad things, and artists, sports stars, musicians, actors. So how do we put together the fact that these artists, I say, or these directors he uses in his own life, Woody Allen, right? He's like, Woody Allen, shaped my childhood. These movies were so great, and yet here he is doing these horrible things. How do you put those together? And the answer he comes to is something like, well, you do the best you can, you know,
Yeah.
which I think is a good answer.
Yeah.
And it amounts to, like, we're not going to find the perfect solution, but the important thing is to try. And I completely agree with that. He's more drawn to the idea of self-improvement, and I'm more drawn to the idea of self-forgetfulness in the
Mm,
face of the things of importance outside of me.
interesting. I like that. I feel like I'm kind of in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
I do understand the self improvement angle,
Mm-hmm.
but I think I lean more towards the self forgetfulness because I think a little bit about me is like I had this revelation maybe a year and a half ago where I thought that like everything in my life that was good, that what I was successful at was because of my ego. Where I was like, I
Mm-hmm.
can't lose this because this is where my motivation comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an aspect of self improvement that feels based in ego. There
Mm-hmm.
is an aspect of ethics that seems based in ego. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think I like your answer of leaning more towards self forgetfulness because it seems like maybe the better answer is not to be concerned with how can I be better, but like I think this maybe the conclusion you came to as well, but like how can we be better? And it's
Mm-hmm.
like trying to build a collective morality rather than one that's so singular. Because the theme of my podcast is "Don't panic, we're all gonna die." That's the name of it, right? And like,
Mm-hmm.
no, if we become the perfect person, we still end up in the same place as everyone else, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, the lasting impact is like trying to leave an imprint that helps other people leave better imprints. But I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
how that relates to your study in ethics.
Right. So it's similar. So the paper that you mentioned, that the title of which I'm unreasonably pleased with. I'll bet you think this blame is about you. So that's riffing off the Carly Simon song, "You're So Vain. I bet you think this song is about you." And for ages, people have wondered, who's this song about? Is it Warren Beatty? Is it Mick Jagger? Like, who's she been sleeping with that she wrote this song about? The point of my interpretation is that the song's about her,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's about her. It's about her experience. It's about
Yeah.
how she's been, it's not about the womanizer, it's about the woman.
Yeah.
And he's so vain, he thinks it's about him, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way, so that I'll bet you think this blame is about you. The thought is that when we realize that we failed in some way, ethically, morally, that we failed, we tend to think that's about us. Like, I failed,
Hmm.
as though we had gone to some Olympic competition and screwed it up, right? And like and it's,
Yeah.
you really can get the feeling, especially around people who study ethics, that like, oh, it's like the greatest human accomplishment to be an ethical person. That's like the best thing possible. It's the Olympics of humanity, and you screwed it up, right? But
Yeah.
my thought is, like, if you encounter your own moral failure in the same way you would encounter, like, you're screwing up your ice skating routine in front of the Tokyo Olympics or something, you've really misunderstood your situation. Because the most important thing in your
Yeah.
situation is not your failure. The most important thing in your situation is the person you've disrespected or hurt.
Mm.
Your failure is actually really a pretty boring fact. Like, you're the only person who thinks that's exciting.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So everybody else in the situation is going to be more concerned about the fact that the other person is hurt than the fact that you screwed up. And so that's what I mean by a kind of self-forgetfulness, or kind of like the idea that the way in which we're defensive in the face of moral criticism. I kind of feel like that's I spent a while kind of deep in Christianity, and I feel like that's the lesson I took from it, is the idea of grace, and the
Mm.
idea that your own failing is a really boring fact. It's like
Yeah.
one of the most mundane facts about you is that you, like everybody else, aren't perfect. Um,
Yeah.
but the more interesting fact, or the more important fact in the case where you failed, is the impact of that on somebody else. And part of the impact on that on somebody else is that you've communicated to them that you don't take them seriously, or you don't give them standing in your world. And so, number one thing to do is to correct that message, not to beat up on yourself. um,
Right. It's kind of like when someone like maybe spills a drink on somebody. Like I had this situation happen where like I was at a restaurant with my mom and this waiter spilled like 5 beers on her and he was like so embarrassed for himself. And I was like, bro, like you just spilled 5 drinks on my mom. Like, we're all way more concerned about that than your embarrassment.
right, absolutely.
Yeah.
How about getting a towel? And right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, can I get a t-shirt or something? Like free advertisement? Yeah, I'm following you. I wanted to ask you about the trolley problem.
Uh-huh.
I guess like I'm curious what makes a trolley problem such a hit for moral philosophers. But if you have a better philosophical problem that you like more, like a more interesting ethical dilemma, I'd love to hear about it. So if it's the trolley problem is like the be all end all, I'd love to hear you expand on why that is the case. But if there's a better one, I'd love to hear it.
Oh, that's so. The trolley problem is not my favorite, but it is the right one to start with, I think.
Yeah. Would you mind explaining it for listeners?
Yes. So here's the thing: is that the trolley problem, as it's gotten loose in the popular imagination, is not the trolley problem. So the trolley problem, as it exists in philosophy, has two pieces to it. And the first part is that you're a trolley driver, and you are in a bad situation because your brakes have gone out, and there are 5 people on the track ahead of you, who you will kill, because you can't stop. But there's a side track to which you could divert the trolley. However, there's one person on that track, and you'll kill that person. And so then the question you face as the trolley driver is, do you turn the trolley onto the side track? And you have to hold it fixed so that the people can't jump off the track, and make them all innocent people.
Yeah.
Um,
Two options.
uh, Right. So sometimes people think that that's the trolley problem. Like, do you turn the top trolley? But that's only the first half of the thing, right?
Hmm.
So the first question is, do you turn the trolley? If you ask students this, not all of them, but 85, 90% of them will say, yes, you turn the trolley. And if you ask them why, they say, well, it's better to have only one person dead than to have 5 people dead. You say, okay, great. Now you need the second part. Here comes part two. In part two, you're not a trolley driver anymore. You're a transplant surgeon. And you're the world's best transplant surgeon. So all of your transplants always work. You're having a terrible day because you have 5 patients, all of whom are on death's door. They're all about to die if they don't get the transplant they need. One needs a heart, 2 each need a lung, 1 needs a kidney, 1 needs a liver. But all is not lost because you have another patient who came in for his final checkup. He's in great shape. He's doing really well. And he's a perfect donor for all 5 of those people. So it occurs to you, right, that this one guy is hogging all the good organs. And you could, using your skills, redistribute them and save 5 lives. And the question is now, do you do the transplant? Do you kill the person and do the transplant? And the 99% of my students, there's sometimes one who wants to be a pain in the butt, but most of them will say, no, you absolutely can't transplant the organs. But then the question is, well, why not? Because you just told me in the trolley case that it was better to kill 1 in order to save 5. And it's the same setup here. So why can't you do it here when you can do it there? And so the reason this is such a go-to in moral philosophy classes is that it very vividly sets up a contrast between what gets called consequentialism as an ethical theory, which is the ethical theory that the right thing to do is the one that brings about the best consequences, which is how you're thinking in the first trolley case.
Right.
And deontology is an ethical theory which says, no, it's not all about the consequences. Sometimes people have rights, sometimes there's constraints, and sometimes the ends don't justify the means.
Mm-hmm.
So the consequential element is sort of no harm, no foul. Deontology is no, the ends don't always justify the means. It's not who wins or loses, it's how you play the game.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big unresolved tension between those 2 ways of thinking about ethics. And this so-called trolley problem, at least when you use both parts, is a way to quickly get your undergraduates to see that they do in fact have both intuitions, and that the 2 sets of intuitions are difficult to reconcile.
Interesting. And what's kind of running through my head as you're explaining the trolley problem is that, like, it seems like for everything or almost everything, like it's like the context that's so important. And that's like for humor, for this problem specifically, for philosophy, for history, like context is always important. And it feels like when we try to paint these huge laws and apply them to something without considering context, I feel like that's where maybe a lot of mistakes are made. And I think maybe that's where a lot of philosophy is based on, is like trying to debate, well, outside of context, how do we think about this thing? And it's really hard to do that.
Yeah, so there is a moral theory called particularism that says that its basic idea is we can't give these general principles, that everything's so particular to the context. I am not a fan of it. As somebody who finds contractualism very appealing, I think that what ethics is trying to do is tell us how we justify ourselves to one another. And for that, I think we're going to appeal to principles that have some amount of generality, because if things are incredibly particular, it's hard to see, why. It's hard to understand how you're going to get notions of fairness, which involve treating people the same across different circumstances.
Yeah, or I'll even say get anywhere. Like if you're too concerned with the context behind every single situation you're discussing, then it's like then it's just then you might as well just say, well, it's not even worth discussing because the context is too important. So I appreciate you calling me out on that because you definitely have a great point there. Moral psychology, it encompasses moral identity, judgment, character, emotions, reasoning, all these things. Which of these do you think we lack most today, and where do you think we shine? And maybe we don't need to do society. Maybe we could just boil this down to Americans.
So I tend to think that um, that ethics, as I think of it, which is just this minimum thing we need to do to live respectfully with one another, which I keep calling it minimum. It's not minimum. It's very hard to do, but it contrasts with the with sort of the perfect human or the ideal life or something. So I think that difficult to achieve minimum runs on empathy and consistency. So if you're thinking like, how would the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How would you like it if other people treated you that way? Like those kinds of thought experiments are the ones that the basic love, the basic minimum demands of respect are running on. And the things that they need are empathy, that is an ability to imaginatively understand someone else's experience, and consistency, a way to treat people fairly, the same, not give special treatment to one and not another. And what we are seeing a lot of in our political culture right now is a lot of calls for consistency that have no empathy in them. And so a lot of fake equivalences or to me painful attempts at equivalences that aren't equivalences. Yeah. So I think empathy is what we're not doing well with, and I think that's in. I don't know why people fail to be empathetic, but generally, but one reason is fear and insecurity.
Largely, philosophical canon, it's dominated by males. So I'm just kind of curious to hear from you. Like, what are the consequences of that, and what do you think might be different if more women were given the opportunity to be philosophers?
It's a great question. So it's not just that it's been dominated by males, it's been dominated by males from pretty much a single social strata when
Hmm.
when you think of it broadly. Now, it's true that there's some who have come into it from poverty, some who, but by the time you're kind of established in the canon, a lot of those people are people who had professorships, people, more or less from a single social strata.
Hmm.
And and I'm increasingly aware of the ways in which that has structured our thinking about ethics, because it has made certain questions not visible. And I mean, so contractualism, the theory that I most like, is a theory for people who are equal, right? I mean, it's the theory you come up with when you are looking around at people who are all in your social strata, and I don't mind that because I think it's the ideal. So I think that's good. But I'm trying to think of an example of a way in which. Well, so for example, I just wrote a book review of a new book out in my subfield of free will and moral responsibility, and it's written by a man who is very interested in the Stoics, as you are, and Buddhist philosophy, and he believes we do not have free will, and he believes that means, and he believes that moral anger is essentially retributive, and because we don't have free will, we should give up on moral anger. And so he's arguing for this. And part of his argument is that it looks to social psychology to show that expressions of anger are counterproductive in bringing about socially positive outcomes. And part of my response to him, or my what I want to say back is, well, first, I disagree that all anger is retributive. I disagree that when I'm angry with the entrenched chauvinist, say, that I think he could have done better, and that I want to cause him pain. Like, I don't think my anger, I think my anger is less about him than it is about me, and how I've been treated. And then once you think that the anger is not retributive in that way, if you look at the, at the studies, at the fact that anger tends to not, that the expressions of anger tend to generate non-constructive outcomes. Here's a thought you might have. It takes two to tango, right? So on the one hand, maybe we should train ourselves to be less angry, or maybe we should train ourselves to be less defensive and fragile in the face of anger, right? And that kind of looking at it from that other angle, I think, is going to be more available to those who have not been on the top of the social strata, so to speak. Who are those who have been in a position to be angry about their treatment with people who they don't have any reason to think will change, and yet think it's wrong to ask me to adopt the peaceful and stoic response. Maybe instead you should get over your bad self and start being more empathetic to my situation. So
Yeah,
that's an example.
that's a great example. The last question I had for you was, I think the main theme of The Good Place, and maybe contractualism in general, is this question of what do we owe each other? I think that's the basis of it. So I just wanted to ask you, what is it that we owe each other?
So the answer given by Tim Scanlon in his book, and it is justification, that what we owe one another is a justification. But he means something very specific by that. So he thinks that when you feel guilty, when you feel like you've done something wrong, if we get past all the things Freud might have said, past all the things Nietzsche might have said about, the various baggage that you might have, he thinks that at the bottom of that is that that you did something to somebody that you couldn't justify to them.
Yeah.
Where the couldn't isn't that you couldn't in fact do it, because maybe you're a really slick talker and maybe they're kind of a doormat, and maybe you could convince them that it was okay. But even if you could convince them it was okay, in your heart, you would know that it wasn't really justifiable to them. And he thinks that that's what it is to do something wrong, is to do something that, if, to go back to that contractualist situation, if we were all trying to come up with the principles that we would agree to govern ourselves by, and you pitched the principle, oh, I'm going to treat you this way, that person would have a perfectly good objection to say, no, we shouldn't have that principle because it treats me badly. And so he thinks that we owe one another a justification. But what he means by that is we need to be able to look one another in the eye and honestly be able to say, I've governed myself, I've made my choices in a way that is in accord with the general rules that we could all agree to if we were all giving one another symmetric standing and trying to decide what those rules should be.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just some basic level of a human empathy and kindness when interacting with other people.
Yes, that would be it. So another way to put it is yeah, I mean, it's a slightly more technical and worked out way of do unto others. I mean, that's the thought. But the famous problem with do unto others is you would have them do unto you, was pointed out by Immanuel Kant in a footnote, which is if you were a convicted criminal and you were standing before a judge who was about to sentence you, and you could say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the thought is that the judge should show you mercy, right? But that would
Yeah.
undermine justice. And so Kant thought there's a big problem with do unto others. And the problem is solved by the kind of elaborate thing I keep saying, which is to try to take it up one level to general principles. Like we need rules we can all agree to. So you can't have like special, the rules of fairness don't count these special one-off kind of mercy issues.
Yeah, it's particularism.
It's something else.
No.
Something else. But anyway, that's So what we owe to each other is fairness, justification, respect.
Great answer.
But to do that will require empathy, because otherwise you'll confuse treating yourself as special with being fair.
Yeah.
There's a book I pitched Mike Scher's book, How to Be Perfect, earlier. There's another book that I think is a good one called Assholes, a Theory, by a man named Aaron James, who's a friend of mine, and was in graduate school with him. But it's basically contractualism, but made into this more popular book about what, so the asshole is the person who thinks they're special and thinks the rules do not apply to them. And so that's the central form of wrongdoing in contractualism, is thinking you're special, thinking, you don't have to live according to the rules that everybody else does.
It's I've heard you mentioned the Assholes book for sure, but thank you so much. I wish that we can go on for another hour, but maybe we could do like a part 2 sometime or something.
That would be great. Great. No, thank you. It's been fun.
Did you like that conversation? I hope you did. To me, it felt like we were just scratching the surface in a lot of ways, so I'm already excited for our next one. In the meantime, if you'd like to keep up with Professor Hieronymi, feel free to check out her blog, as well as her book, Freedom, Resentment, and the Metaphysics of Morals, and I'll link both of those in the show notes, so you can feel free to find them there. If you'd like to keep up with me, feel free to find me on any form of social media at Here's Johnny Nava, and I hope that you've been living a beautiful life out there. Although Pamela and I might disagree whether or not this is even possible, I do hope that you are trying your best to be a good person. Until next time.